To start with, I would just like to point out that the Noble Lord Timpson is undoubtedly personally committed to resolving this issue. Nobody, I think, is making any party political points, and nobody is personally having a go at the Minister. But that is not sufficient for us to go home with tonight either. We still have to say, regardless of how honourable and wonderful the Minister might be, IPP has dragged on. And so I will be voting with the Noble Lord Thomas Geith's amendment. But what's more is, since he spoke so brilliantly to start this debate, all of the speeches have just been as though I've never heard the subject before. I feel like crying, I feel like screaming. I mean, in other words, this is an incredibly important scandal that gets to you every time. And actually, it gets to members of the public every time when you share it with them. They are equally as appalled. They can't believe it. So one of the things that I think we need to do is, one of the points that I noted from Lord Thomas's amendment is, that it will make, I wrote down, it will make the indeterminate determinate. There'll be an end in sight, because apart from anything else, I mean, never mind the sentences, I feel as though this debate is sort of indeterminate and going on forever, because I seem to have repeated it endlessly and endlessly. And when I heard, UNGRIP making the point that the current decrease in IPP prison population, it will take a minimum of 11 years to release everyone currently on an IPP sentence. That's 31 years since its introduction and 24 years since its official abolition. I mean, you do think it's got to end. We can't just keep... This isn't... Nobody's doing this as a joke or for a game to just make the same kind of speeches. I would like to say that on Amendment 96, the Noble Lord Garnier's amendment, which particularly appeals to me, a couple of things that I wanted to just note about it, and I'm not always a fan of judges, it has to be said, but anyway, in this instance, one of the things I like about it is every single prisoner would be looked at. Each and every circumstance would be considered. That's what I think is very important, because I do think there have been times when I've spoken when it made it sound like a one-size-fits-all. You know what I mean? Release them all or what have you, right? And I think that this has the advantage of taking into consideration every single circumstance, what the particular prisoners would need, and I think that's very important. I also think that it notes, and this is something that hasn't, I don't think, had enough mention tonight, that in some instances, the resolution of this is that a prisoner will need to be transferred to a hospital, and it might not be straightforward to just release them from a hospital. They might be very seriously ill at that point. But the main thing would be that, because the end would be in sight, that if they were ever well enough to be released from hospital, they wouldn't then go back to prison on the IPP sentence, which very often has made them ill in the first instance. I just wanted to quote this psychiatrist who said, "How do you motivate somebody to take part in treatment at the hospital if the outcome of that is effectively to facilitate their return to prison?" And I do think that's a terrible tragedy. Right, I'll just finish with only one anecdote, just because I think it makes the point. Rob Russell, who's on an IPP sentence, is actually in prison at the moment, was sentenced in 2009 for making threats to kill his former partner. Now, I hope I've illustrated today, when I've spoken, that I'm not a fan of being soft on domestic abuse perpetrators, right? This is somebody who threatened to kill his former partner. But he was sentenced in 2009. So we're talking, and he's never been released, by the way. He's now in hospital, and I don't want him to go back. I want him to get well, but I don't want him to go back to the IPP sentence. But can you imagine if he gets well and he goes back to prison? He could be on the same landing as somebody who's been convicted for domestic violence, not threats, but violence, of actually having committed violence against their partner. But as that person is on a standard determinate sentence, they could be offered early release, earn your way to release, but Rob won't. And he actually just threatened. And I, honest to God, think that is grotesque. But the government minister today, who I'm a great admirer of, justified the risks of freeing people who are violent, who've been violent, early, on the basis of freeing up space in prisons because we have to protect victims and give them space. I would just say that IPPers might well present a risk when they're freed into the community. But as has now been explained, so will all of those people on early release that we've just discussed all day. There's no doubt about it. Something will happen with some of them. I don't wish it, I just know it. And the fact that the IPP are the ones who have to prove every time that they will never do anything again is just ludicrous. I was thinking if I was Rob, who's been mentally ill, and you had to compare yourself with this person who's getting out early, the sense of frustration and hopelessness on your own part would honestly help make your mental health deteriorate again. So I just simply think that it has to end, and we have to do whatever it requires. I do think the minister would be helped if it was legislative, and whichever amendment works for me. I'll vote with it. But something, this can't carry on. And I know that it's too melodramatic. I just mean genuinely it needs to end, because in the grotesqueness of it in the context of this sentencing bill, this releasing people for a wide range of reasons, and we can't release people who are in prison decades after their tariff for minor things, and we won't even look at assessing each of them to see whether they might be safe beyond the IPP parole board thing. It's just ridiculous. So.